This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at reactroundup.com/KendoUI. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of React Roundup. This week on our panel we have Nader Dabit.
Hello.
We have a special guest host, that's Sia Karamalegos.
Yes, hello.
I kind of sounded that out in my head first. I hope I got close.
Yeah, it was good.
I'm Charles Max Wood from devchat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's James Sinclair.
G'day. Hi from Australia.
Now, the show's pretty new, so obviously we haven't had you on before. Do you want to just introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. I'm a web developer. I work in Canberra, Australia, which is actually the capital city. And I work for an organization called Squiz, building what we call a digital workplace, which is kind of like a fancier term for intranet. Yeah.
Nice. Well, we have you on to talk about, I'm trying to remember because it was like all kinds of, there was like 3 or 4 things. It was React, Redux, and JavaScript architecture, which all seems pretty general.
Yeah. It was probably because of an article I wrote, which was inspired by the work I do at Squiz, where I found that most of the people I talked to didn't really understand why you would ever want to use React. Most people were coming from a jQuery background, and I could point them to plenty of articles to get started. So here's how you do a React application. Here's how you get started with Redux, with the sort of tutorial how-to guides. But nobody was really explaining why you would want to use them.
Gotcha.
So are the people that you're working with, have they been working with JavaScript for a long time and they're just kind of skeptical about like getting into some of the faster evolving ecosystems in JavaScript, or is it kind of more like they're very comfortable with jQuery and it's getting the job done and they're not really interested in learning something if like what they have isn't broken?
So a bit of both, I think. So there's a mixture of people. Some people were sort of junior developers and were just sort of finding their way around modular JavaScript in particular. And then a bunch of other people who were just used to using jQuery for everything and didn't really see what the benefits were. And it also came out of collaborating on a particular project where as things happened, the project got behind schedule. And so one of the developers jumped ahead and started doing the sort of static cut-up work, building the HTML, CSS, and chucking some jQuery into to do the basic sort of interactions. And then I came along behind him and was doing some of the more complicated work for, say, integrating credit cards and more beefier parts of the system. And I was using React, and we saw that you could see the code side by side. And he was writing all this monolithic jQuery that was really hard to debug and really long and complicated. And he was kind of flabbergasted by these tiny little React modules that I was creating that he was calling the magical, because he couldn't quite understand what they were doing, but he could see that they were much more elegant than the way the jQuery code was working.
Yeah, I read your article and I really enjoyed it. I feel like it was a good reminder, even for experienced devs, of like why we use React. We already have ideas in our head, like the way we think of components and building web pages as a series of components. But I liked a lot of the other points you brought up, like how it's just faster to look up a value in a plain JavaScript object versus querying the DOM.
Yeah. I remember the first time that I was kind of convinced that React was a good idea was at a conference where, of all things, they were talking about immutability and the OHM framework. And so it was basically a really, really long talk all about how triple equals is much faster than comparing objects with a deep compare when you dive in and compare every single value inside. And in some ways, that's the whole story of why React can be fast, is because a triple equals is a much faster to look up than doing a deep object compare. But not many people sort of understand that, or why that is, why React the way it is. And I also find that even just modular web components are a big idea for some of the junior developers I talk to. So I wanted to break all that down and explain here's why React is the way it is. And you don't have to be too scared of the JSX if you don't want to be.
So is your team moving now to React, or have you already moved to React, or how is that looking at your company?
So my particular team has moved to React. When we started this project for Squiz Workplace, we mandated that this will be React. We developed our own special technique for making React work well with a CMS, which was interesting and fun. But the rest of the company, they're a mixture, because if you're doing a small website, you don't always need the full-blown power of React. A sprinkle of jQuery here and there will work and get the job done. But for larger, more complicated applications, like the one I work on, we're doing React.
What about Redux? I mean, you put in React, Redux, and JavaScript Architecture. So I've heard some people push back on Redux, that it's too complicated, or that it's it's not always necessary. Where do you kind of come down on that?
That's a really good point. So I did put a section on Redux in that article as well, because I saw a spate of articles going around saying, "Oh, Redux is over. Redux has had it. It's we're moving on. We're writing our own version." And most of them seem to be listing all the advantages of Redux as if they were disadvantages. So things like you have to have pure reducers, and the only way to set state is through these reducer things, and there's so much. It's so lacking in opinionation, so I can do anything I want. And I'm thinking these are all good things, but it does lend itself to a particular kind of application where you do have a lot of shared state, where you have different parts of the application that need to interact with each other. So what Redux does is it organizes things so that you can have a consistent, understandable way of understanding. If I change something way down in the component tree, I know exactly what's going to happen to my state as a result of that.
No, I was just kind of curious. So, like, what's the current stack that you're kind of choice for you? If you were going to build something brand new, like today, like what would you use as far as like a JavaScript stack in the React ecosystem?
For me, I'd run pretty vanilla React and Redux. I'd probably Downshift hadn't been released at the time that we started our project, so that would have been a handy thing, because we do a lot of sort of type ahead type widgets, which that is designed to make easier. But mainly just a bit of a Webpack to glue everything together, and React and Redux to manage state and build out our components. And has any of you heard of something called Conditioner.js?
Mm-mm.
So that's a short little library that what it does is it scans your page looking at the DOM and looks for data attributes. And if any match a particular pattern, it says, oh, this component on the page needs to be a React component. And it will hydrate, as they say, that particular part of the DOM and replace it with your dynamic component. And the reason I mentioned that is because we independently invented our own particular version of that, so that it would work with a CMS. Because a CMS, you don't always have a single page app. So most React tutorials assume that you're making a single page web app, whereas we're working with a CMS. So we needed some way to say, when we load the HTML on the page, these particular parts of the page need to be React components, and they need to be initialized with all the Redux state as well. So we wrote a little library that'll scan for those data attributes. And I thought I was particularly clever, but it turns out somebody else has already built an open source library for it.
Nice. I kind of want to go back to some of the ideas that you had around, you said kind of sprinkles of jQuery. You mentioned that, and you mentioned it in the article too, that, React might be overkill. And then you've also talked about maybe you just put React in situations where you're not building a single page app. So I'm kind of trying to figure out where you split the difference, right? Where do you just say, okay, well, this app, yeah, some jQuery, I'm good, or maybe, something lightweight like Stimulus.js. And then maybe you're looking at it and you're going, okay, well, maybe my sprinkles really need to be React components. And then you get to the point where you're saying, you know what, this needs to be a fully blown, full page app, single page app.
Yeah, I guess it depends on what you're building. So if you're starting out with the intention of building an app, then probably a single page app is the tool you want to reach for. And these days with server-side rendering, that's a whole lot easier. For our particular use case, we're working with a CMS that's similar to something like Drupal or WordPress, but we wanted to layer a lot of complicated application logic on top of that. So we wanted to have all the benefits of a CMS, but also we have these complicated messaging systems and sort of social media style commenting things. This is kind of what digital workplaces do. And we knew that we had a fairly heavy support burden. So we'd have people calling us up, and things like the Redux time traveler make supporting and debugging much easier. So we wanted to have those sort of tools available to help us out in the future. So I guess the two key things for me, if you're building an application, then build a single page web app. If you need lots of shared state, then Redux is the tool of choice. And yeah, if you're just building a website that needs a carousel on it, maybe you don't need a huge framework like React.
Gotcha. What about Redux?
So Redux is trickier. My rule of thumb tends to be when I know that a lot of different components are going to be sharing state, and that's potentially going to be confusing. That's when I reach for Redux, because that's its core value is you got a bunch of components that interact, and it's not always obvious how one is going to affect the other. That
makes sense. And then I guess the last. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and that's the beautiful thing about Redux is it's not as complicated as people make out. It's quite a simple library. You could write it yourself. It's just that because it's so simple, it's kind of like the game of Go. I don't know if any of you have ever played that. It only has a few very simple rules, but because of that, it becomes very complicated in all the things that can possibly happen because it's quite a large board. I find Redux is similar in that there's only a very few small number of rules, which means you can do a whole lot with it because you're quite free to take it in any direction you want.
Yeah, I like this idea of the concepts, or for me at least, learning Redux really helped me think in a more functional way. And I like how you frame that, how these concepts are also more portable to learning. To me, that's really interesting how you can apply those things. Like once I realized I was basically building Redux in a vanilla JavaScript app, I was like, well, maybe I should just use Redux.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you bring up functional programming as well, because that heavily influenced why I thought Redux was a good idea when I saw it, because I'd been starting down that journey of learning about functional programming, and it makes a lot of sense to be able to, it's particularly when you're managing state, to be able to say, okay, I know that when I make this change, I know exactly what's going to happen in my application. And so it makes testing easier, it makes reasoning about the code easier. And as I was sort of pointing out in the article, it makes a whole bunch of other stuff suddenly possible that wasn't possible before.
Yeah, so how do you try to convince someone, because I do feel like a lot of people don't necessarily learn like the core concepts of Redux before they pass judgment on it, or, I mean, of course, and everyone has different needs, but how do you kind of make that case?
That's a tough one. Generally, if I'm leading the team, then I just mandate that that's what we're doing. But my approach is actually to start with functional programming. Actually, I think once people, even just the functional iterators like map, filter, reduce, once people start to use those in their code, and they see a whole lot of complexity suddenly disappear, because that's the beauty of those things is, right, you write one line, and that expresses what 4 lines were doing before with a for loop. and it expresses more information in less lines of code. So when you see map, you know that it's creating another array with the same length. With a for loop, you have to read through the whole thing to work out whether that's what it's doing or not. So once people start to get functional programming, then Redux makes a whole lot more sense, as well as React. And so people start coming along that journey. Also, even just for convincing people to use React itself, if they haven't been doing modular JavaScript before, that kind of blows their minds that they can build much neater, much smaller, easier to manage components that don't need to be these massive blobs of jQuery code.
So I'm kind of curious, what's your thoughts on GraphQL, and have you used GraphQL at your company?
We are just experimenting with it at the moment, sorry. A colleague of mine just spun up a server that would interrogate our CMS database and expose it as an API. But we're just starting down that path. But I can see from what I've read about it and little bits that I have done with it that it's going to be particularly useful for reducing the number of queries and joins that we do, and could speed up our development time a lot. Have you guys started down that journey? You're doing a lot with GraphQL these days?
So I've done quite a bit with it lately because I work with AWS, and we're building the managed GraphQL service called AWS AppSync. And I've never actually built anything in production there, so I'm kind of more working on the developer advocacy side, kind of integrating new features and stuff into that service and talking with developers, kind of finding out what they're looking for. In my experience, though, the hardest part for me has always been to build a real world GraphQL server that actually implements things like authorization controls and fine-grained access control and things like that. I think just spinning up a pretty basic server has gotten pretty easy at this point. There's a lot of good stuff out there like Apollo server and Prisma, but I think taking it from hello world to actually something useful is like the problem that has yet to be solved, I would say, like in a simple way. We're trying to do that with AppSync, and then I think we're going to see a lot of stuff happen over the next year, and other companies might be introducing some things for that space, because I feel like that's kind of an unsolved area so far.
I do like, have you heard of Apollo Link State? So it's kind of Apollo's answer to managing state, but within GraphQL. So if you already have a GraphQL backend, how can we start managing state with that same idea? And I feel like that might be a compelling thing for me to switch. Clearly, I like Redux, but but like something that kind of changes the paradigm. You know, it's really interesting. Yeah, sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, I saw someone give a talk on that recently, and it was the first time I'd actually seen what it was. I had heard of it, and it didn't make a lot of sense to me until I actually saw someone kind of give a talk on it. And after that, I was like, okay, this is pretty cool. So it's basically like you have your Redux store, saved like elsewhere in your application at its own little area and its own level. And then your whole app kind of has access to that data, that state. It's something like that, except that, of course, instead of using Redux, you're using whatever you would like, really. But you're also getting the benefits of getting your GraphQL queries and mutations and stuff like that all handled through the link state.
Yeah, it does sound pretty cool. It's interesting that you brought up the authentication side of things, because and I really need to write an article on this, but we still work with these traditional old CMSs like Drupal or Squiz Matrix, which is our particular one. And there are a few things that a CMS still gives you for free, and things like authentication and roles and login screens and admin screens that often when we charge in to try and create these single-page web apps, you forget that CMSs have solved a lot of these problems a long time ago. And if you're building an application, that can be a sort of good base for starting something.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I've been looking at that for the podcast, right? Just, basing a lot of the access that people want to the media or to the, the different things that are involved there. And I've been using WordPress as my back end and just trying to figure out, okay, how do I open all this stuff up? And WordPress does have an API, and they also do have GraphQL plugins, but they, it's not completely 100%, clear how to use all that stuff. But at the same time, all the data structures and everything else are pretty well understood, and so you can get a leg up that way without having to design the entire system.
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't take long before that permissions type stuff can get really complicated. So having someone else have done some of that hard thinking for you can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, it seems like we don't talk about CMSs as much as we really should, because I wonder how many, when we apply to real production applications, how many of them are CMSs, and we just kind of ignore that fact when we go to conferences and we hear talks and things, and they're all about more traditional backends.
Yeah, I have in my head that I really want to write an article on this about making React and Redux and things work with your creaky old CMS, because we do kind of treat them like they're the sort of old, hairy, old, scary monsters that nobody wants to talk about anymore. But they do a lot and power a lot of the internet that we use day to day.
Now, I'm curious, does that change the structure of your front-end app at all if your back-end is a CMS?
Yes, it does. So that's why I was bringing up conditioner earlier, because the way that CMSs work is you never know in advance what you're going to need on that page. So you may know that you need, say, a menu, for example, that needs drop-downs that you want to control, but you don't know what else might be on that page. So you have to be prepared for anything, which means that things like code splitting and being able to quickly hydrate your application without too much lag time become really, really important when you're looking at performance. I don't know about you guys, but have you guys done much performance sort of tuning of your React applications?
Oh, yeah. Actually, this is a topic I really love. It sounds so dry, but I actually really like diving into performance. Although now I've taken it even beyond React and more looking at like how we build and how the browser renders things and things like that. But definitely an exciting topic. What kind of tools do you use for performance optimization?
So in terms of actually getting optimizations, we dove pretty heavily into the Webpack code splitting when that was updated. It's sort of about a year ago now. So for us, it makes a lot of sense because we can optimize first load. We know that sort of 80% of the time somebody's coming into the home page, so we can make sure that we've got everything we need in the bundle for that. But if somebody is just on the home page, they don't necessarily need all the full calendar features, for example, or they don't necessarily need the crazy org chart application that we built. So when you go to those pages, we download those dynamically on the fly, and we display a sort of grayed out placeholder while that code's downloading.
So does having a CMS backend make that whole process more complicated? I'm imagining it would, but I don't actually know.
Well, that's where we found that so writing our own version of conditioner really helped. So what CMSs are really, really good at is putting HTML in a page. And if you can indicate in that HTML this particular blob of content here that needs to be transformed into a dynamic React component. So we do that with the data attributes, and then we have one to say this is the type of React component it should be, so the name of the component that it is, and then we also pass in attributes, kind of like you would pass in React props. We just have to double encode them so that they can fit in HTML. And then that allows us to pass information from the CMS through to the React component, just like you would if you're doing a normal sort of React JSX. And then when we hydrate that, we pass that information through, and it all it's kind of magical. It all just works.
For you, Loot Crate is offering an opportunity to save 10% on any new subscription at lootcrate.com. Just enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings. Loot Crate is one of my favorite things. Every month I get a box in the mail. Costs less than $20, and it comes with all kinds of goodies. I have stuff from, just looking at my shelf, Batman, Spider-Man, Ninja Turtles, Back to the Future, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, and much, much more. So if you're a geek, a gamer, anything like that, and you want cool stuff to put around your office, cool t-shirts, comic books, etc., then definitely check out Loot Crate. To save 10% on your new subscription, go to lootcrate.com/Ruby. Again, that's lootcrate.com/Ruby to save 10% on any new subscription. Enter the promo code BRIDGE10 for 10% savings.
Yeah,
I'm an old Redux dev. I like magic.
But I'd love to hear about what other people are doing to sort of performance tune their React apps, if you guys are working on any of that kind of stuff.
I'm still learning React, so I'm happy when it works.
I've worked a lot with React Native, really, and with React Native, there's a few different things that you can do, but really it has a lot to do with, at least in my experience, optimizing render methods and optimizing lists in general. With lists with React Native, it seems to be usually a stumbling block for most apps, where if you have a list of over a few items, you have to kind of really, really figure out like where the problems are, if it has to do with your images, if it has to do with the pagination, or if maybe you have like an infinite scroll. And it really, for me, it's been mostly with React Native versus React Web, and I don't think we have as good of tooling for performance as the web right now on React Native.
That's actually really interesting, because I do more web, and that sounds so much easier. Whereas with web, it's like you're trying to optimize your bundles and how much JavaScript is there, and trying to reduce it so that there's less to download, parse, and compile and load, and figuring out if things are like above the fold or below the fold, and things like that. So yeah, I started working more on that part, because I'm like, oh, the React side was, I don't know, it's not easier. It's just different.
Yeah, when I see discussions around performance on the web with React these days, I'm completely lost. When I see like code splitting and Webpack and all this stuff, like I understand Webpack for sure, but I definitely don't have any clue how I would do the code splitting and all that stuff.
Yeah, I used to be very afraid of Webpack, and then I started a vanilla application. It was just like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And that's when I finally learned Webpack, thanks to, I think you had Yuho on another time. And I look up so many things on Survive.js. But also the Webpack docs have gotten a lot better. It's really interesting, all the things you can do to just optimize, or it helps you optimize a lot of things automatically, like images and stuff like that. Oh, yes, I wonder how you would do that more in React Native, because you don't have the same build tool. Like, how would you say, hey, can you just optimize all these images for particular sizes and offer up different source sets?
So it's not as easy for sure with React Native. It just depends. You can have helper functions that rely on certain data, that like maybe how your network is doing, or the type of device you're on, and kind of do it that way just by manually writing that type of functionality in, at least in my experience.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, though, about the differences between performance optimizations for the web versus React Native, because just that very act of having to download your JS bundle up front makes things a lot more complicated, right? And it's a double-edged sword. So you might defer downloading some code with code splitting so that you don't have it there immediately. So that makes the initial download faster. But then that makes, when you want to actually use that code that you need later, it makes it slower. So you were constantly trading off these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like the time to interaction can be just as frustrating as like time to load, or like time to, like, when you see it on the screen, you usually expect it to work, and because of our delayed JavaScript, sometimes it doesn't. It's an interesting problem. I had another question on that, but it slipped my mind.
Well, then on top of that, that's just getting the bundle. Then the other thing that we have to contend with is then the application performance itself, like having to check, well, is it doing unnecessary renders, and tracing down why things are changing the way they are. I don't know how you guys do you guys do any of that kind of performance optimization as well?
Yeah, using like dev tools to look at renders and the profiling. Yeah. Not any specific tools right now. There used to be a perf plugin for React, but they took it out of the core package. I forget at which point.
Yeah. I say that's an area where I do find Redux is helpful because it has that magical time traveling debugger. So being able to switch between states and say, okay, when we go from this state to this next state, we can see here's all the bits of the DOM that have to change in response to that, and being able to trace through which bits maybe are rendering when they shouldn't, or are doing unnecessary work is really, really handy. Have you any guys tried the Redux time traveler and all that kind of stuff?
I haven't done it specifically, but I do use a tool with Sentry that basically logs all my Redux actions that are performed. So it actually makes it a lot easier to debug errors in production because I know like the steps that the application has gone through, and then I can try to repeat them.
Yeah, that's one of those magical things that just that one simple rule that reducers have to be pure kind of makes possible in Redux, and kind of blew my mind when I first learned about it. Was because it's just a sequence of actions, and everything you need to know about the application is recorded in those actions. You can do things like, as you say, you can log all of them to a logger, which means that you can watch things happen in real time, or you could stream people's actions if you're doing some kind of live coding thing, for example, and you get this time traveling debugger, which we enable in our production app with a special query string. So we just detect a query string and we load that middleware, and that means that we could say, for example, download the entire state of the application on a client's machine, put it on a disk, take it back to our workstation, and then spin up the application again and see it in exactly the same state that it was on the client's computer. And that's really handy for being able to debug things and work out why did this widget change the way it did, or why was it throwing this error at this particular point in time. It's just kind of amazing when you see it. And just having a slider there, you can just roll it right back to the start, watch things load as they come in and out. It's really fun.
And then you use get blame to give somebody a hard time, right? So one thing that I'm curious about, the article said Redux, React, and JavaScript architecture. And it seems like a lot of times, at least in my applications, some of the problems come down to, there's a tool that solves that, and you're talking about Redux, and, some aspects of React are probably going to solve some of these issues too. But then you've got other things that it's just like, you know what? I kind of designed this poorly, and so now I'm paying the price on it. So how do you actually architect your apps? Like what principles do you follow in the way that you put your apps together in order to solve some of the issues that make applications more complicated or harder to debug or maintain?
That's a really good question, actually. And that's probably one of the key reasons why I'm now such a fan of React, is that it strongly encourages you to break your application down into small components, and then piece your application together from those small components using composition, which is kind of a functional programming concept as well. But because you're working with small isolated units that you can test easily, that means that it helps manage the complexity. But then on top of that, you've got to think about layers for getting the data into your code. So in our particular application, we have 3 different servers that we're talking to, and we knew that sometimes they might need to change out. So we have a sort of a network layer, I guess, that tries to normalize the way we're talking to different servers, even though they're quite different in the types of data that they're using, and then that sort of sits behind the Redux store. And then on top of that, we have our React application, which uses these small components.
Yeah, I really like the idea of small components. Just being able to look at something and kind of at a glance see what it's about makes things really nicely. I kind of had to get over, and I've heard this a lot, I kind of had to get over everything being in the same file with JSX. But once I got past that and realized that I could look at it and see what it was in one place, there were a lot of things I really liked about the approach.
Yeah, actually, this is a good point that I probably don't talk enough about, is that we actually have our own custom bundler. So the way we structure our application is that we break it into a folder full of modules, and each of those modules contains some sample HTML that we expect the component to output, plus the SAS file, which has the CSS, and then any JavaScript or JSX files that build the component. So our custom bundler allows us to keep everything that's related to a single component all together in one folder. So it might not be in the same file, but you can at least see in the structure of the way we've put our file tree together, everything that is in a module belongs together. And I think many people understand that that's a possibility when they're doing React and Redux in particular, because they're sort of, you often have all these reducers sitting in one massive file. They make they get lost. So I actually have to say that the way you structure your file system does make a big difference to the maintainability of these larger applications.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I always struggle with that, or I go back and forth. I mean, how do you decide what the best way to organize that is? I mean, like, is it like by feature or by, like containers versus components? And then also, like, how do you organize your actions and reducers along with all of those?
Yeah. So I guess the question of how you break down features versus components is always going to be a tough one. And you kind of have to just do that by feel, I guess. But my rule is everything related to the component goes with the component. So if there's, we normally try and keep the actions and reducers together. So maybe I should explain. Do you guys know about the container component pattern? So we try and keep all our view components as pure functional components. So all they have is a render method, and that's it. So that keeps those very simple. And then in the container component, that's where all the business logic actually lives. So all the action generators are in there, unless there's a heck of a lot of them, in which case we'll split them out. But all the reducers live in that component as well. So everything you need to know about the business logic of that component lives in that container component. That's just our rule for how we do it. For a smaller application, I can see why you might want to keep all the reducers or all the actions in one file. But to me, that never made a lot of sense. So I much prefer to keep the logic of when I'm thinking about a single component, I just want everything for that component in one place. I don't want to have to go searching through the file system for it.
Yeah, that reminds me of in object-oriented programming, single responsibility principle. A lot of people think of it as, your object or class has one job, but what it really means is that everything in that class, or in our case, our component, are things that are likely to change at the same time. And so if you keep them together, then you can go and you can see the entire concern at once. And so, that's kind of what I'm hearing you say, is that, all of your reducers, even though they're all parts of different layers, because they're all likely to change at the same time, you put them all together so that you can just work on that one feature, component, whatever you want to call it, at the same time.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's I'd forgotten that was the name of it from my software engineering study days. But yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. Just instinctually, I suppose.
I wanted to take a step back for a second, because as I was reading your article on React, Redux, and JavaScript architecture, I realized, and then also like your next one, what's the point of art? I realized like you have this pattern of like a deep thinking on a topic explored through the written word. And I found it really interesting. Like, how do you, or I guess what in your opinion helps you to think of these things in this way, or break down some of those concepts in order to really convey what people need to learn? I'm very interested in how people learn, I guess, because that whole like speaking and teaching workshops and things like that, it's very interesting to me.
Yeah, I guess like most people, I think I often write out of a sense of personal frustration. It helps me get my thoughts straight on what things I'm challenged. Repeated patterns or repeated conversations that I'm having with people. So the the React one article and one of my previous ones on test-driven development, like I found that I was having the same conversation over and over with people that unit testing is not the same thing as test-driven development, even though lots of times we accidentally use those terms interchangeably. They're very different things. I had a sort of epiphany one day when I realized that the whole point of test-driven development isn't actually getting tests. They're just a side effect. What's really good about test-driven development is it teaches people to code in really, really small, tiny increments. And so I gave a presentation on that to some of the guys at Squiz. And then because I'd been having these conversations, it just kind of flowed, and I wanted to put that down on paper after I'd done it and published it as an article. How about you guys? I'm very curious. I think most of you write in one way or another or prepare talks. How do you guys start your thinking process for those kinds of things?
Sia, you've been doing a lot of this lately. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
Or maybe sometimes it's frustration. I think you dive deeper than I do, but I shouldn't say this, but I feel like when I feel like I don't know something well enough, then I need to more deeply explore it. And I kind of chart that progress as I go. And because I'm like, oh, this could help someone else. How can I help the next person? And so a lot of the ones I talk about are like new things to me, which is probably makes you not the most qualified person to talk about it. But then also, I don't know, I feel like it's easier for people that are new to it to approach that type of a talk or article or whatnot, because it's from that standpoint of someone who isn't so deep in it that they forget, what they didn't know before they knew it.
That's totally fair. I mean, it's so easy to forget how hard it is for people who are new to these concepts or even to our industry, because some of us, like me, have been doing it since the days of IE6 and the browser wars and all of that. But for new people, it must be so overwhelming. Like Webpack on its own is complicated enough, let alone React and Redux and all these things. So I more power to the people who are writing about the things as they're learning them, so that we don't lose that perspective on things.
Yeah, also, I have a similar story as far as preparing talks and stuff like that. I usually am either that like brand new to something or the complete opposite. I'm like really deep into something because like I feel like for me to do a talk on it, I need to be really excited about it. And it's really easy for me to get excited about something I'm learning or that I want to learn. So I'll usually get a talk put together around combining like a new topic along with something else that's interesting. And usually meshing those two things together can come up with some interesting topics. And then if it gets accepted, I'll spend the next couple of months like learning it well enough to be able to talk about it. Or if it's something I already know really well, then I feel comfortable talking about it as well. But it's interesting that you said like I think you're right when it comes to teaching something. And if you're doing something for so long, you have a lot of assumptions that usually are not correct because you just forgot a lot of the things that you didn't know that you didn't know like a long time ago. So when you're learning something new and you're teaching it, you're almost a better teacher sometimes than people that have been doing it for 10 years or so.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I also like how clearly you have a creative side as well. And I don't know about you, but I sometimes struggle because I like to encourage that part. But it's like I love to write applications, but I also feel like you get so, or maybe I do, so into the zone and so focused that it's hard to like take that step back and give time to like just that thought and rumination, which is really required for like deep thinking on a concept. So I'm kind of curious as to how you make that time or how you I don't know. This might be also like the frustration with social media and getting like addicted to things and like how do you take that step back and like open your mind to more creative things and innovative things?
I could probably kind of approach it from the opposite direction in that I kind of use writing as a way to force myself to think because we are all caught up in this constant like if I'm not on Twitter, then I'm probably listening to a podcast. And so I need something like writing to force me to turn the headphones off and step away from the social media. And I just find that, unfortunately for me, 4,000 words is about the right amount of time to get that thinking done, which makes for some long articles. Yeah.
Oh, but they're great. I really like them.
This has been a fun conversation. We've kind of talked about a lot of different things.
Yeah, we have bounced around a little bit.
Yep. All right. Well, let's do some picks, and that way James can go back to bed for a couple hours or something.
Oh, yeah.
Early morning over there in Australia.
And you too.
No, I have to go pick up my kids from school.
Oh, that's right.
Nader, why don't you start us out with picks?
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device, on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
Sure. So my pick is a self-serving pick this week. It's my YouTube channel. I've been having a YouTube channel for React Native training for a long time. We have a few thousand subscribers there. I've since also created my own YouTube channel, and I have a few hundred followers now or subscribers. I'm going to be doing a lot of stuff that isn't React Native specific, but some React Native stuff there. So my React Native training YouTube is all React Native stuff. My personal channel is going to be more around JavaScript, GraphQL, and just things that aren't, of course, React Native specific. I'm doing a lot of AWS stuff too. So a lot of AppSync stuff will be there, and Amplify as well. So I don't have like a YouTube URL yet, but if you just Google Nader Dabit YouTube, or if you go to my Twitter feed, I'm Dabit3 on Twitter, you'll see me tweeting about my YouTube videos that I'm putting out. And that's it for me.
Awesome. Sia, do you want to do some picks?
Yeah, I don't know what they are, though.
So,
Oh, my bad. I forgot to run those by you. I'm sorry.
yeah, we'll blame Nader. Yeah.
Well, I've given her like an email with all the information, and I like completely left that off.
So what is the pick?
I like delegating blame. This is good.
Get blamed.
Yeah, essentially picks are just shout outs about things that we like. So
Oh, cool.
it can be technology, it can be TV shows, books. I mean, we have people pick all kinds of stuff. So sort of whatever's making your life awesome right now, that's what you pick.
Yeah, okay, so I'll do this, and I'm going to jump on the AWS bandwagon again. But we had Collision Conf here in New Orleans. I live in New Orleans. And Amazon did like these full day multi-talk, they called them workshops, but they were more like talks. And it was really interesting to see a lot more of the AI and machine learning stuff. And I think before I had seen this one talk by Asim Hussain, who's actually an Azure developer advocate, maybe, about the bot of the US. I didn't really realize how approachable artificial intelligence is nowadays. And so I really want to play around with that. I started making a bot for like speaker feedback, which was entertaining. And I really want to learn more. And then, of course, using that as a starting point, like diving into machine learning as well. I think it would be really cool stuff.
Yeah, I was at Microsoft Build last week, and they talked a bit about their bot services. Cool stuff. I'm going to jump in here with a couple of picks myself. One of the first things that I just want to do is I want to briefly. I missed the last few episodes. I almost didn't make it to this one. And it's mostly, well, part of it was travel, and part of it was just that my dad passed away a few weeks ago, and I've just been kind of dealing with life. And so mostly I just want to pick, being around family and friends and just taking the time to, to see everybody and get to, the people you haven't seen in a while, take a minute to reach out. I mean, I saw people, including some cousins that I hadn't seen in a few years. And, it's kind of sad to me now just to think, oh, you know what? If something happened to them, it'd be like, oh, well, the last time I saw them was a few years ago. Their kids were really little. And anyway, so take a few minutes just to spend some time with family and friends and, make sure that you're spending your life doing the things that really matter. Coding, the things that we do here, I feel like they do matter because we do help people, but it all contributes to the larger quality of life that we have. And, so don't lose sight of all of the other things and all of the people in your life that matter. It's a little self-reflective, but that's kind of where I've been living the last few weeks. So anyway,
that one.
James, do you have some picks for us?
I feel it's kind of hard to follow that one.
Sorry.
But no, totally agree. I do have some small ones. So the first one is a package called Highland.js. And what that is I don't know if you guys have ever experimented much with reactive programming like RxJS or Bacon.js. What Highland does is it puts that same layer over node streams. So if you've ever done node programming, it allows you to treat node streams as if they were a reactive stream or an observable. And so I wrote my whole blog engine with this because Gulp works with node streams. And so you could take a Gulp stream, transform it into a reactive stream, and use all your reactive programming techniques to build out your static site. So that was really fun. And I think this particular package just doesn't get enough recognition for the amazing stuff that it does. So I want to tell people about it. Yeah, that's right. And the other thing I wanted to pick just quickly was functional programming in general. I'm really enjoying the way it changes the way I think about code. And so I'm enjoying it so much that I'm planning to write a book about it. So that's just been filling my head lately. And it just is so much fun to think differently and to see the way that it plays out and makes coding more magical.
Nice. I have a quick question about Highland.js. Is this something that you could plug into, say, RxJS and start using some of their operators and things like that on, or?
It's more that it has many of the same operators built into it. So it kind of does the same thing that RxJS does for events. It does for node streams.
Cool. One other thing I just want to shout out about then is if you're having trouble getting into functional programming, we just had Kyle Simpson on JavaScript Jabber, and we talked about his book, Functional Like JavaScript. And that kind of was, I had trouble getting my head around it, and he kind of dumbed it down for me. So,
yeah, I'll always be thankful to Redux for teaching me more about functional programming.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, James, if people want to see what you're working on now or follow you online, where do they go?
You can find my website at jrsinclair.com and on Twitter at jrsinclair.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming and talking to us.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Well, we will go ahead and wrap this up, and we will catch everybody next week.
Cheers.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit